Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the EMA and FPA for the opportunity to speak here today. And I'm going to acknowledge up front that the comments I'm going to make are consolidation of thought from multiple organizations, and that these are challenging issues. So I imagine that different organizations may have different positions on particular aspects, and different individuals across this room may have different perspectives. And I think it'll be important to have that discussion with an open mind. So I'm going to start by outlining the context where placebo is mentioned. The draft EMA guidance mentions placebo as a comparator for superiority trials evaluating disease modification of multiple sclerosis, in addition to brief mentions in the context of acute relapses and repair of stable disability. The current discussion is framed within the scope set by the guidance. The use of placebo-controlled trials to demonstrate efficacy and safety of new therapeutic interventions must be considered in the context of ethics and human rights protections, as was just mentioned. The Declaration of Helsinki allows for placebo study designs under specific conditions in Article 32, where, for compelling and scientifically sound methodological reasons, the use of placebo is necessary to determine the efficacy or safety of an intervention, and the patients who receive placebo or no treatment will not be subject to any risk of serious or irreversible harm. Extreme care must be taken to avoid abuse of this option. With regard to placebo-controlled trials in multiple sclerosis, the consensus position of international experts has been, quote, placebo-controlled trials can still be done ethically with restrictions. In relapsing MS, for which established treatments exist, placebo-controlled trials should only be offered with rigorous informed consent. I will point out that both of these references are from 2008, and there have been additional disease-modifying therapies that have been approved for relapsing MS patients. But the thinking that's outlined in these references remains valid, and I think that's an important point. With respect to the scientific merit of placebo trials for evaluating disease-modifying therapies, this is well established. In phase 2, we've had numerous placebo-controlled trials in relapsing MS that have demonstrated proof of efficacy, as well as informed dose selection, and in some cases, patient selection for further study in phase 3. In placebo-controlled phase 3 trials in relapsing MS, we have demonstrated the efficacy of novel therapeutics on clinical and MRI parameters while characterizing the safety profile. Typically, this has been done over 2 or, in some cases, more years. And I think it's important to outline that, as a design, the placebo-controlled trial is scientifically very valuable, and they're efficient, and they're also interpretable. Because we do have treatments available for relapsing MS, we also have to consider the unmet need when thinking about the use of placebo. And the appropriateness of placebo may vary accordingly. In all settings, though, where placebo design is considered, patient protection from harm, rigorous informed consent, and importantly, patient autonomy need to be emphasized. In progressive MS, we don't have proven effective therapies to modify the progression, including in PPMS and in SPMS, and placebo studies remain viable for developing therapies in these indications. In relapsing MS, as mentioned already, we do have treatments that are approved. Therefore, placebo-controlled trials should be proposed in very well-defined circumstances and offered with rigorous consent. The considerations here are very complex, as you all know, and really these should be deliberated on a case-by-case basis. There are many considerations involved, some of which were highlighted earlier this morning. 2 examples that are explicit cases in RRMS include the limited use of placebo in short-term studies that may be acceptable if the scientific value offsets the minimal risk of harm to study patients, and trials in which an experimental therapy complementary to immunomodulation in an add-on setting are also feasible and acceptable. When considering the potential for serious or irreversible harm, it's important to consider the evidence that's available. This is one piece of data that I'd like to show from a 2-year double-blind placebo-controlled trial comparing fingolimod to placebo, and this is the Freedoms trial. What I'm showing is only the placebo arm data. This is a post hoc analysis presented by Dr. Gary Cutter earlier in the year. And what we're looking at is the impact of a relapse on EDSS scores. And so this is the change in EDSS score from the immediate EDSS assessment preceding the relapse onset. And then on the top panel, the EDSS assessment at least 30 days after the onset of symptoms. So it's the first EDSS assessment following the relapse. And what you see is that 51% of patients already have no increase in EDSS. And these were patients with confirmed relapses that either had to have at least a 0.5 increase in EDSS or an increase in functional system scores. So 51%, even at the first EDSS assessment after relapse, have already recovered. On the other hand, there are 49% with increase of 0.5 and 26% with an increase of 1.0. Some of this may reflect measurement variability, as we've already heard about this morning. We extend this analysis, and when you look at the bottom panel, what you see is that patients do continue to recover. And this is extending the analysis to the best EDSS on study. And you see that by this point, at the end of study, 70% of patients who had a confirmed relapse have achieved their pre-relapse EDSS score, while 30% continue to have an increase of at least 0.5. I want to acknowledge that these are limited data. We don't know what happens to the patients after the trial. And we've also heard this morning that the impact of a single relapse on the long-term disability may be marginal or negligible. So I show these data for 2 points. One is to refocus on the individual patient, because when we're talking about the potential for serious or irreversible harm, it's important to remember that we're not talking about abstract designs, but we're talking about patients, and that's what we must consider. On the other hand, I also want to make the point that we need to consider continually the evidence that's available about whether or not the exposure to placebo leads to serious or irreversible harm. And I think from the discussion this morning, we've already heard a spectrum of opinions. And so this is very important to consider. Now, with these data in mind, I do want to point out a couple limitations of the design features that we do implement in our clinical trials. Study features to mitigate risk may not necessarily avoid worsening in a subject receiving placebo. Rigorous informed consent and reconsent are commonplace, but there is a potential for disease activity on placebo. In addition, we also have escape with rescue therapies as a standard design device, and these also do not necessarily prevent events that may have happened up until the time that patients do escape. I do want to point out that this same potential for worsening also applies to patients in active control trials under experimental therapies. Now, theoretically, these therapies should work, but we shouldn't be lulled into a false sense of security that they actually do work until they're proven effective. In terms of active comparator superiority trials, these pose an execution for evaluating modestly efficacious therapy that may have favorable safety profiles. Such designs favor improvements in benefit risk on the efficacy side, but improvements in safety may be equally valuable. Active comparator superiority makes sense when we have highly efficacious therapies because the design is feasible. But in this case, it may not be, and here placebo control may have to be considered in a carefully thought through way. Non-inferiority studies designs may also be a solution in this instance, but so far these have been difficult to execute. And in particular, finding agreements on non-inferiority margins and managing sample sizes has been always a challenge. So we haven't seen such a design to date yet. There are a couple brief mentions in additional contexts besides disease-modifying therapies. There's a brief mention in terms of treatments intended to improve apparently stable residual impairment. And I'll echo the point that Diego made earlier, that this is mentioned here as a construct, but it's not really defined. I'm not saying that we need a definition here, but in order to interpret whether or not a placebo-controlled design would be appropriate, I think more detail about how these designs would be put together would be helpful. If it's in the context of an add-on to a disease-modifying therapy that's established, I think that would be fairly straightforward. But again, it really depends on the details. In terms of treatments for acute relapses, this is brought up in the context of either reducing the duration or severity of relapses or prevention of their sequelae. What's referenced is a 3-arm trial, which was mentioned earlier, that includes methylprednisolone as a positive control and a placebo arm for internal validation. Now, this, again, may be possible as a design, but I think it also depends on the details, because for patients who have severe relapses, there may not be comfort with not treating them with methylprednisolone. For example, spinal cord relapses with transverse myelitis. So in summary, the field is moving toward active comparator superiority studies of immunomodulators for demonstrating disease modification in relapsing MS. However, there are real unsolved challenges that exist in designing executable superiority studies in certain contexts and non-inferiority studies. And I think we'll hear more about these in the subsequent sessions. Active comparator studies with high efficacy therapies are appropriate. We have examples of successfully completed trials in this area. We also have ongoing studies, so this can be done. Active comparator superiority studies for immunomodulatory agents with modest efficacy but favorable safety are not viable. And here, placebo designs may have to be carefully considered. In addition, non-inferiority studies may be considered if the challenges can be worked through from a design perspective. I think I want to make the point, echoing the theme earlier this morning, that placebo control could remain appropriate, and I think we should keep an open mind to this. Now, oftentimes when we talk about placebo-controlled trials, we automatically think about 2-year randomized 1-to-1 or 1-to-1-to-1 studies, because that's historically what's been done. But when I speak about placebo control and placebo designs, it doesn't necessarily mean 2-year exposure even for relapsing MS patients, and I think that's important. We don't want to say that placebo cannot be done, because I think, going back to this morning, there are also points about endpoints that may be developed in the near future. There may be endpoints that are more sensitive, that may allow for a different kind of design, as opposed to the 2-year placebo-controlled designs that we've used to try to demonstrate efficacy versus EDSS. So I think it's important to keep an open mind here, that there are a lot of potential innovations that may be coming down the pike from an endpoint, patient selection, and/or study design perspective. With respect to progressive MS, placebo control remains appropriate in designing superiority studies. Further elaboration in the guidance could allow a better assessment of the appropriateness of placebo in the context of acute relapses and in the context of apparently stable residual disability. And I think a very important point here, the MS treatment landscape will continue to evolve, and the ethics of placebo in each therapeutic context must be reevaluated on a continuing basis. And this is a discussion that has to be had on a regular basis. So thank you for your attention.